Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is your Net General bringing you another Legendary Lord lore video for Taurox The Brass Bull, this newly added Legendary Lord in the Silence and the Fury DLC, which dropped last week. Now, a quick note to some long-time subscribers to the channel. Some of this audio was taken from an older video I did a couple of years ago now, looking at the missing Legendary Lords for the Beastmen. If you're curious who the other missing Legendary Lords are for the Beastmen, do check the top right-hand corner now, or there'll be a link in the description below. Apologies if it's a bit late, but here we go. Let's take a look at the story of Taurox.
Taurox, the Brass Bull, the Slaughterhorn, the Blood Beast. Now, Taurox was a mighty Minotaur chieftain in his own right when people first started to notice him in the Warhammer world. He struck down any foes who faced him, he was notoriously angry, and would fell any opponents who would make any form of eye contact with him, which one could equate to some kind of sociopathy or something like that. There's definitely something not right in his head, but if you made any eye contact with his stern visage, he would just strike you down there and then. And this led to him being known for always having blood-soaked feet, whether it be through the blood of his enemies or the blood of his allies. Now, due to this sort of imposing nature and his strength and his ability as a fighter, he very easily managed to impose his will on any other lesser beastmen, thus quickly building up a war herd of his own for which he marched through most of the different areas of the empire. But at some point, he tended to find himself in the Great Forest area of Talabakland, as highlighted here. And he started sort of roaming and reaping and rampaging around this area for a fair amount of time, gathering a war herd to him and challenging any other war herds that stood in opposition to him as well. It got to the point that his rampage of carnage across the Great Forest had drawn the attention of the Fell Powers and the Chaos Gods themselves. To this point, they wanted to sort of open up a channel of communication with Taurox, see if they could maybe guide his lust for destruction and murder into a way that would be more useful for them. So one day after a battle, Taurox is standing over one of his enemies, and a hand starts to form out of the visceral intestines and blood of one of his fallen foes, and that hand starts to form an arm, and eventually this foul emissary creature made of blood and sinew is crawling out of the remains of this body. Now, Taurox, not necessarily being one for words, sort of stands there stoically in silence watching this happen in front of him, but much to the emissary's error, as soon as he formed a head and a mouth and was about to open up his proposal to Taurox, he made the mistake of making eye contact. And as soon as he made eye contact, Taurox, with his disorder where he doesn't like anyone making eye contact with him, immediately attacks, grabs the emissary by the throat, and in one foul swoop, bites off his head. Now, he has his war herd around him at this point, and they're slightly bemused that he, without realizing or interacting with this object, Taurox had bit off its head, and ever since he'd done that, had just stood there as still as a statue, in complete silence, not uttering a word or moving a muscle. And then suddenly, he starts to convulse violently and collapses on the ground. Now, during his convulsions, he's tearing at his own flesh, he's biting himself, and Taurox has a vision, and it's a vision of a world awash with blood and afloat with corpses. Eventually, after sort of tearing at himself and convulsing horribly, and his warhead gather around him out of concern, he wakes up and just goes crazy. He grabs his two axes, he starts just hacking down his own war herd, hacking down anything near to him. Eventually, after a few hours, he's completely annihilated his entire war herd, killed every single beastman he had gathered under his banner, and his rampage doesn't stop there. He rampages and kills anything he finds. He comes across covens of witches, comes across mercenary ogres, wandering bands of human merchants, just soldiers, troops, anything and everything that happened to cross his path as he was carrying on this rampage around the great forest of Talabakland, was struck down in very quick succession. After a year and a day, he reaches the small town of Liebstedt. Now, in Liebstedt, he kills every single citizen he comes across, and again, it's just continuing this year-long rampage of murder and bloodlust that was driven on by him eating the head of the Fell Powers, this emissary they'd created to talk to Taurox. So eventually, he's killed so many people in this town of Liebstedt that an actual river of blood has started to form at his feet. The blood is just pouring down the main streets of the town. Having spent this year rampaging around non-stop, finally his last ounce of energy and life is really spent, and he collapses into the river of blood and sinew, exhausted and dead. The Fell Powers, having very much enjoyed the rampage they've witnessed over the last year, have decided that that's not the end of Taurox. That's not the end of the potential carnage he can reap upon the world. Under the scarlet moon of that evening, they resurrect Taurox, and blood is still flowing from his massacre of the town. He wakes up in the river of blood of his own making, with a new brazen metal body. And the gods had blessed him with this new body, a body that would no longer tire, that would never run out of energy, that would allow him to keep killing to his heart's content and give him no respite from his constant state of rage and bloodlust. And as he stood up, he put his hands into the river of blood that he'd created earlier that day and drank deeply from it. And within his stomach, the pints of blood he'd consumed began to boil within his metal frame. His new frame making him a Minotaur of legend, and had obviously had the blessing from the Fell gods, and it wasn't long before he'd gathered another huge host to him. But this time, he obviously had a modicum of self-control, and was not just slaughtering them all upon seeing them. He'd regained some of his mind and was able to think strategically as he had done before eating the head of the emissary. So he's gathered this huge host to him, and at its head are a huge column of armored minotaurs, said to, when in march, spread themselves a mile long. That's how many minotaurs he's called to his new army. And whenever they get the scent of flesh, they are prompted to rush off in a frenzy stampede into that direction, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. They are still in Talabakland at the moment, around the region of the Great Forest, and they've been causing ruin and destruction amongst a number of different settlements. The Empire has sent out some outriders to follow their trail, and the riders, whenever they arrive at a site of this destruction, whether it be a flagellant camp, or a temple to Sigmar, or a temple to Ulrich even, they just find blood smears on the walls, no signs of bodies, no signs of anything else. And if their investigation holds true, the trail of destruction seems to signify that Taurox is heading right towards the capital of Talabheim. This is where he seems to have angled his rage and lust for blood and destruction. Now, Taurox's transformation wasn't completely finished. He wasn't fully metal. There is a vulnerable point on his throat that can still be struck. So it is still possible to kill him, despite the fact every other sort of inch of his skin is completely made of metal, and thusly has given him a huge amount of armor and made him near indestructible. So that's how Taurox became the roaring, snorting engine of destruction he is today.
Now, as you can see, Creative Assembly have made a couple of changes to where Taurox starts out. They're putting him against Oxotl in this DLC package. Not necessarily a classic enemy of his. He should be really placed in the Empire if we're sticking true to lore, but, you know, it's a fun new area to play around with him. And they've changed a couple of things about his appearance as he was described in the old tabletop rules as well. But, you know, while I've got you here, let's talk a little bit about his old appearance and how he played on the tabletop as well.
Now, Taurox himself has two horns, obviously, as any Minotaur, but they're bladed at the end. He somehow managed to embed blades into the ends of his horns. His teeth and mouth are also made of metal, and it's become this sort of gnashing metal maw for which he eats things alive and drinks deeply from pools of blood he's created. In terms of his gear and stuff, he has his brass body, which gives him a crazy amount of armor. He also has his 2 axes, which are known as rune-tortured axes. And these axes have burn on them. They have the ability to burn whoever they strike. They're magic weapons as well. And on the tabletop, you can't make armor saves against his axes. So they'd have to be heavily armor-piercing axes as well. So as you see, with that combination of his kind of strength and armor, he really could be a complete machine. On the tabletop, the gap in his brass armor around his throat was actually a weakness. And if you rolled 2 6s on 2 dice in a row when you were looking to hit him, that would actually kill him instantaneously. So I'm not sure if they would find a way of making that mechanic play out in Total Warhammer, that if something very untoward happens, he sort of dies instantly. I don't think that would be fair. That's sort of the aspect of randomness. It's often on the tabletop, but would be hard to incorporate in a Total War game. So essentially, you're just making him a complete monster and melee machine. And that about sums it up for Taurox. He is a great character. He never had a model on the tabletop, so
It's been fun seeing how Creative Assembly adapted his model and how they took him into the game of Total War Warhammer 2. Hope you guys have been enjoying rampaging around the new world, killing the lizard men with Taurox in the game so far. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video on
Taurox, the Brass Bull, the Slaughterhorn, the Blood Beast.